One of my favorite tools as a painter to help me guarantee my paintings will be to the best of my ability is studies. If you've ever had any questions about how do you know what to study and what to do to help your paintings, this video is for you. I have put together 6 studies in particular that I think will all but guarantee a really good outcome. In fact, I considered making this video titled something like how to give yourself the best chance to make a really good commission. Obviously, I'm not very good at hooks and titles, but all that to say, I'm so confident in this method that I think another way of selling this video would be to say, if you are preparing for a commission or an otherwise high stakes painting, like for example, I do book covers, magazine covers, I do commissions where I really do need to show up and be able to make a painting the best of my ability. If you're a painter, you know that especially when you're sort of newer or even intermediate, even still now for me, that I will sit down one day after a long day working in the yard and cooking, and I'll come in here and I'll bang out a little masterpiece on a piece of paper. And then there's other days where everything is seemingly all prepared for me to make a masterpiece, and I will slog through an otherwise pretty mediocre painting. That is to say, you can't always control when and where you have good paintings, and nor should you try to overly control it. There's some of, a creative practice that is the fact that it's kind of left up to the painting gods, so to speak, is kind of the fun part about it. But there are times and there are moments where you need to be able to have your best performance. And it's in this video that I'm going to share with you 6 studies that will get you as close as possible. So if you want to see those studies and hear some of my thoughts on how to incorporate studies into your practice, then let's just jump into the video. If you're someone who the thought of doing a study seems just a little bit too challenging for you, that is to say the novelty of painting something new outweighs the benefits of painting something 5 or 6 times, then by all means, don't do studies. I've had students in the past ask things like, what should I paint? And I always say the same thing. What you should paint and how you should approach your practice needs to be a very personal choice, right? I would say start with still life, start with certain kinds of painting from life. But if your interest only extends to a certain set of surrealist portraiture, and that's the only thing that's going to keep you interested enough through the hard parts of a painting, paint what you're interested in. If I don't think someone could have paid me to do studies my first few years of painting on my own. I did my 4 years in college and I was done doing things that I didn't want to do. So if that's you, that's fine. There's nothing wrong with that. But if you do have a little bit of curiosity and a little bit of patience where you could sit down and paint something theoretically 5 times, then please let's jump into the video and I want to share with you some of my studies. The thing about a contour line drawing is that you are looking at your subject matter, whether it's from life, which I think is a great way to practice, or it's from a photo, and you're developing that familiarity. I typically like to start with a lighter line, so think like an orange or a yellow. And then the thing is, when you grab a darker color, like let's say a blue or a purple, you are drawing that darker line with more familiarity of the subject matter. So oftentimes what happens is your initial drawing is kind of wonky because it's hard to just go in and jump in on something and accurately draw it. And then by the time you do it the second, the third, the 4th time, you've developed the familiarity. And I always think that this is a great way to start out, especially understanding the proportions and the relationships of the objects to each other. If you draw something 3 or 4 times, you're going to develop a familiarity that's only going to serve you in your painting. Notan is, I believe it derives from a Japanese term. That is to say, it doesn't mean that there is no tan in it, although there isn't. It's just black and white. But you're first going to do a really rough drawing. Again, the focus is more on the value than the drawing, so don't stress yourself out with the drawing too much. And you just are going to find all the things that are light and dark. A lot of times landscape painters will do this because when you're painting, especially a middle of the day or a bright sunny image, things tend to very directly fall into shadow and into light. And being able to tell where those things are can help you to use some really basic understandings of shadow and form in your painting. All that to say, a lot hinges on your ability to look at something and gauge, is this in the lighter half of my values or is this in the darker half of my values? The next one is a 3 value study. So you have your black, you have your white, just like a Notan, but you also now introduce something called middle gray, which is a gray that sits visually in between white and black. Don't be tempted to measure out equal parts white and black because pigments are, like I said, very imperfect. You want it to visually look like it sits between the two. That in and of itself is a good exercise to be good at sort of mixing your own values and gauging what is visually between the two. Joseph Albers, for example, talks a lot about optical mixing and visual mixing and the ability to sort of mentally know what sits between two colors, but start with value, always start with value. This is helpful because this is where we first start to see real form takes place. If you want something to look like it is from life, then you're going to want to do value studies and have a good understanding of values. Now you could certainly stop here with these two, but again, I like to make myself aids, which is why I really like to have a 5-value study. When I was in college, before we ever got to move on to color, we had to clock in and do our time in both drawing, so many semesters and hours spent live drawing the figure, and then we could move on to value. And even then, I remember we had to make 3 really good value studies before we could move on to color. You're not in school, you don't have to do that, but what I would recommend is you have your 5 values. So again, black and white straight from the tube, middle gray, and then you're gonna find a value in between middle gray and black and a value between middle gray and white. And they should be evenly spaced to the best of your ability. Again, that is in and of itself its own exercise, and if you become proficient at that, it will only ever serve you. But the nice thing about this is take your time, really sift it out. In fact, if you're painting from photo, I would recommend getting a version that's completely desaturated so you can check. You can also use something like those red heart glasses to better see your values. But if you spend some time and do a really good job, even if you have to make a few versions before you get one that looks really close to a value study of your reference, tape up the one that does the best job and use this as a guide. This and the color wheel together are so helpful and so handy. The next kind of study is going to be color studies. First subsect of that is going to be limited palette studies. I find this to be incredibly helpful in understanding and designing. So one thing you can do is establish a limited palette. So I like to do CMY. My personal CMY is phthalo blue green shade. It kind of substitutes as a cyan. I consider this the truest true blue in my personal opinion. People differ on that. Cad yellow light, which to me is a very pure yellow, and then quinacridone magenta, which to be fair is a little more purple than true red, but I'm fine with that. I'm actually totally fine with that. So I will take that, and with the information I've gleaned from my value studies, not overly focus on perfect values or perfect drawing, but really see what the color relationships look like together. Another thing you can start to do in this process is gauge your warm and cools. So one game I like to play is warm where sun hits it, cool where shadow hits it, or where the shadow lives in your painting. And in your color studies, you can really amp this up, so you can really cool down, maybe even bump up the chroma of your shadows a little bit. And remember, if your values are correct, you can kind of do anything with your colors, so you can really play here. But see what that looks like, and then maybe try it again and maybe make your shadows more muted, but really amp up the intensity and the warmth of your light. You can also kind of flip those. I find with portraiture in particular, the shadows do tend to be warm, whether that's they're actually warm or it's a simultaneous contrast. It's a conversation for another day, but try it out here before you get into the painting and you're battling because your background is really vivid and it's not making sense. Play with your intensity in this part of the process. So with these limited palette studies, you can kind of tease out these questions one by one. So what might be helpful and what I tend to do is I'll do a CMY. CMY gives you a pretty big range of color, right? Remember, our printers, for the most part, print with some version of CMY, and they can print kind of anything, which is amazing. And so I will use my CMY to sort of tease out how I'm going to approach color, and I will do often a few different versions. Now, another thing you can do to help you understand color, or just even to practice and gain more of that familiarity, is do more complicated limited color palette studies. That's a mouthful, don't let it freak you out, but one thing I like to do to really see what my color relationships are is I will do a secondaries only palette. I did this with the Topo Chico, and note that there's no blue, and there's actually not a very good blue in this palette because you would mix green and purple to get blue because of the because those are the secondaries that straddle the primary, which is blue. And in theory, you should be able to get a very muted blue. My muted blue was gray. This was very informative for me in this little exercise that I did, because I previously thought that in order to get the Topo Chico to make sense, I had to really nail that blue-green color. And it was very liberating and insightful to know that as long as it was cooler than my 2 pomegranates in my background, that contextually it would read blue. This is something I learned, I filed it away, and it was very helpful come the day that I did my demo. And those are the studies that I tend to do before I do a demo or work on a commission. Here is the final painting, and I did this on a live. I did it for Eric Rhodes Art School Live. He does one a day during the weekdays, and I was honored to be on the show, but I was a little bit nervous, and so I leaned into what I know, which is, okay, if you are nervous, then do your due diligence, do your studying, create these studies as guides, as resources, build familiarity with your subject matter. And it ended up going great. 45 minutes does go fast. So I ended up finishing it off camera, but I was able to use my value study to create this painting. And I know that it was helpful that I had those before. Of course, this doesn't mean you have to have this. And like I said in the beginning of the video, sometimes the freshness of never having seen something before does offer you something. And I will say again, that was my MO for many, many years in my practice. But I'll say that usually there's a balance between the two, that sort of having that familiarity and that practice of doing the repetitions is helpful, and then also having that freshness is helpful. So just like learn thyself, right? Hopefully I've convinced you to do studies. Please do some of the studies that I mentioned, use those resources, and let me know if studies are something you use in your practice or if you plan to use in the future. Also, let me know if you have any questions. And finally, make sure to like and subscribe if you want to see more content like this. And if you want a bigger deep dive from me on any of these subjects, check out my online art school. I have a free 7-day bootcamp to see if e-learning is right for you. And then also, if you're just ready to jump in, be part of the community, join us on Membership Mondays where I go live and answer questions, as well as continually getting new courses over the years, plus the 16 that I've already created, then check out Not Sorry Online Art School.